Immigration has been a key element in the whole of American history, and the numbers are really remarkable. One has to keep that in mind. For example, in the 17th century, the earliest years, when the English population was only about 5 or 6 million, 400,000 British came to what became the North American colonies.
American identity from the very beginning was a complex entity, and it became more complex with the years. The English came over here, but the French were over here. There were Native Americans over here. People from Africa were here from the very beginning of our history, and in fact constituted a larger percentage of the population than they constitute today.
The United States has been a magnet for immigrants throughout its history. In the early years, many who embark on the journey find it necessary to indenture themselves just to pay for the passage.
The southern colonies are established by young men, often mid to late teens and up to the mid-20s. And most of them come over without many resources of their own. And so this whole system of indentured servitude evolves, whereby somebody else pays for their passage, but then they owe somebody at the other end years of service before they can try and set up on their own.
The transatlantic voyage itself, while it was much improved over what it was in the 17th century, it still had all sorts of problems that couldn't be controlled: weather, bad shipping, bad management, and there were many cases where ships had to return to England, many cases where, in fact, they were shipwrecked in places they didn't intend to. The transatlantic voyage was nothing secure.
When the ships have for the last time weighed their anchors near the City of Cows in Old England, the real misery begins with the long voyage. The sea rages and surges, so that one fears to go down with the ship, and the closely packed people in the berths are bumbled over each other, both the sick and the well. That most people get sick is not surprising, because in addition to all other trials and hardships, warm food is served only 3 times a week, the rations being very poor and very little.
He signed a contract with the shipmaster or with a merchant who was manipulating the migration. Those pieces of paper, those contracts, upon arrival were sold to people who bought their contracts. And therefore, they became indentured to the people who owned the contract. And that was random. They had no way of controlling this.
Every day, Englishmen, Dutchmen, and High German people come from the city of Philadelphia and other places, say 20, 30, or 40 hours away, go on board the newly arrived ship that has brought and offers for sale passengers from Europe, and select among the healthy persons, such as they deem suitable for their business, and bargain with them how long they will serve for their passage money. It often happens that whole families, husband, wife, and children, are separated by being sold to different purchasers, especially when they have not paid any part of their passage money.
The most attractive people, that is the most vigorous, the youngest, and the most likely to turn a profit for their owners, were sold on shipboard. Some were not, and those were the least attractive people, and they were sold in a kind of peddling operation that went through the countryside until they went into labor markets in the interior where their contracts could be sold.
The assumption was that because this was primarily an economic enterprise, that male workers would be preferable to female workers, and so the gender ratio was very skewed at first, 6 men for every 1 woman. The authorities soon realized that not having women around meant that they didn't have stable family households, which during this period was seen as very much a guarantor of social order. There was very little social order in the early South, and so they started to encourage women to come across in larger and larger numbers.
In a Virginia Company document, they say it's important that we send families and that we send women to be wives for planters. I think they said something like as a way of rooting the hearts and minds of our men in Virginia to the plantation. So there's a sense of you need permanent commitment. They begin to think in terms of people going there and planning to spend their lives there, not going for a period of years and then coming home.
And some people have suggested that may have put a premium on women and given them a little more choice for particularly indentured servants, white indentured servants, who might marry because of the shortage of women and have a shorter period of indenture, something that the male indentured servant wasn't liable to get a break on.
The length of service for an indentured servant depends not only on their gender or the amount borrowed for passage, but also their age.
The younger they are, the longer they serve on the whole. But 4 to 7 years was fairly typical, at the end of which they are entitled to a small amount of land.
Then they were free to do what they could on their own, and very few of them could do a great deal at once because they hadn't developed any capital to work with. The benefits, the gifts they got from their owner were minimal. Sometimes they didn't even exist in terms of clothes and startup for farming. So they became very often tenants on American lands until they worked up a sufficiency to get their own plot of land.
Turned out in the Chesapeake you needed several hundred acres to have a viable plantation, and if an ex-servant only gets 50, he might pool it with several other ex-servants and they try and work something out on their own. But it'd be a while before he becomes an independent land-owning settler.
They contributed significantly, once freed, to the flow of people, the migration flows within North America, because freed, they then looked for free land that they could establish themselves on. And as I say, some of them, it took some time to work for other people, work up a little capital in order to move.
The portrait of life in New England plays out in stark contrast to the situation in the southern colonies, primarily because New England is settled by family groups.
There are male servants with them, but they tend to sort of vanish from the records in the first 20 years. I suspect many of them just went somewhere else. And so they arrive and have lots of children and reproduce at probably the highest rate, at least in the Atlantic world at that point. But also we think that in New England, probably life expectancy was longer than anywhere else in the world at the time. The classic case, which means it's an extreme, but town of Andover, which is well studied, over 20% of the founding males lived past 80, which means that some of them are still around in 1700. You know.
For the European American women, there was really starting life over, as were men. In some cases with a religious mission, in some cases an economic mission, but often going out into what was the wilderness, and frightful. And for them, too, there was disease, the loss of life, death in childbirth, the loss of children, and really a generation or more to have stable communities form.
The communities that do form play a dominant role in the lives of the families sheltered within their boundaries.
The regulation of marriage is a good example, not just in the United States, but in Europe, modern Western culture. We would think of marriage primarily as a decision of two individuals. This was not how these guys thought of this. It was understood that marriage, although obviously meant to provide security and companionship for people, was also a social obligation. And you had obligations to your family in marrying the appropriate kind of person, but more than anything, a family, a marriage, was supposed to be the cornerstone of a stable family, which was the cornerstone of a stable community.
They described the family as a little commonwealth. It was a microcosm of the larger society. It was not only the space in which people received sustenance and shelter, but it was also the place where people learned how to become functional adults. They learned from participating in the various hierarchical relationships within the family how to participate as citizens in hierarchical relationships outside of the family when they became adults.
To the Puritans, marriage is a contract between husband and wife, validated by a ceremony before the magistrate.
And it meant not that they were necessarily equal partners, because it was clear that the male head of household was just that, the head of household. But it also was a break from the notion that the husband's or the father's authority was absolute or all but absolute. The contractual understanding of marriage meant that male husbands and fathers had obligations and responsibilities as well as rights and prerogatives. And women, Puritan women, could call them on that. Puritans allowed for the right of divorce precisely because of this contractual understanding. And if one party or the other violated the terms of that contract, It could be dissolved, as could any contract. So this allowed for greater latitude for women. Are there lots of constraints? Sure. Is this always lived up to? No. When push comes to shove, is the man in charge? Most of the time. But it is an opening, and it's a significant way of thinking about the relationship of husbands and wives that is different and is supported by their own laws.
Within the marriage relationship, community-prescribed roles and responsibilities are molded to meet the needs of the family.
The household head was responsible for maintaining social and moral order within the family, so that the household was a hospital, a vocational institute, a correctional facility, as well as being the kind of the emotionally nurturing body that we would consider as the sort of the principal characteristic of a family.
There was no such thing as a non-working person. Men generally worked the fields. Women rarely cultivated, although they often weeded the fields, and both men and women participated in harvesting. Women often worked within the household, making soap and candles, and in food preparation and clothing preparation. And in the winter months, both men and women spun and wove, with women taking the major responsibility for both spinning and weaving. And then women generally made the clothing that resulted or out of homespun. Now that's a kind of ideal type portrait. Households didn't always work like that. And many households relied on trading certain kinds of goods for other kinds of goods. So butter and eggs for nails, for example. Products like sugar or tea were bought with cash that was earned by selling grain. So that portrait of a so-called self-sufficient household doesn't encompass all of the way things were, even in the early days of the colonial period.
Children also have responsibilities within the family unit. Sometimes they are apprenticed to another household, a practice the colonists called putting out.
This was a kind of puzzle that I got interested in when I was in college. I read a book by the historian Alan McFarlane called The Family Life of Ralph Jocelyn. It was based on a very nice, thorough diary of an English minister, I believe, in which he recorded meticulously everything about his own family life, of placing out or putting out his children into other people's homes, or taking in other people's children into his own home at different ages, although primarily in children and adolescents. And so his question was, why do this? Especially, why place out your children while you're bringing in other children at the same time? It is hard to understand. McFarlane's explanation was that it may have been a kind of buffer against incest or incestuous feelings. Again, coming back to the tight, small houses these people lived in. Edmund Morgan suggested that when Puritan families did this, they did it because they feared becoming too attached, emotionally attached to their children, and that this was a way of ensuring discipline, and that you would not be inclined to spoil the children of others whom you brought into your household. I thought that putting out was a kind of social welfare. It was a response to some crisis or another that had occurred in that child's original family. The death of a parent or both parents, the abandonment by a parent, poverty, something gone wrong that made it difficult, if not impossible, for that child to remain, or made it undesirable for that child to remain where he or she was.
For most of the 17th century, the number of slaves in the American colonies is quite small. Indentured servants and the settlers themselves handle most of the colony's labor needs.
Now, this was a system that made sense when English labor was dirt cheap, as it was early in the 17th century, when the English economy was in such poor shape, and the English population was growing much faster than the economy. Plus, if life expectancy is short in the colonies, it makes more sense to buy somebody for 4 to 7 years of their life than to buy them for their entire life, meaning a slave.
You might say that the American colonists were the last to come to this notion that they could build their economy most profitably and fastest by bringing in Africans in very large numbers. And indeed, only about 5% of all the Africans brought across the Atlantic ended up in the American colonies. The numbers were gigantic to the sugar and coffee islands of the Caribbean and of Portuguese Brazil particularly.
The central institution for modern slavery is the plantation, and the most lucrative crop that the plantation produces in the Atlantic world is sugar. The producers of sugar become the key players in modern history, and that means that everybody wants to be like them.
The transition from indentured servitude to slavery occurs first in the English colonies in the West Indies, when they hit upon successful cultivation of sugarcane. Once they develop that in the 1640s, they need a lot more labor. They need labor that they can work very hard, and they bring in Africans in very large numbers. The transition then in the Chesapeake occurs mostly in the generation from 1675 to 1700. At that time, the English economy is improving. There are fewer English people who are willing to sell themselves as indentured servants. At the same time, the cost of Africans goes down. So that it becomes, for many reasons, more sensible in the economics of tobacco plantations to invest in an African slave rather than an English servant after approximately 1675.
As a slave society develops in mainland North America, it's a different kind of slave society that develops in the heartland of Atlantic slavery, that is the Antilles, that is the Caribbean. It's not until the 19th century and the advent of a new crop, that is cotton, that the United States, now a separate country, becomes the great slave-holding society of the Atlantic world.
Unlike the indentured servant, a slave's departure from Africa is not a matter of choice.
And one of the things that makes the historical experience of African Americans so different from almost every other group of people that come to be called Americans is that they come against their will. You know, their journey, their travel, their migration is not by choice. It is what we call a forced migration. It's because they travel here as slaves. They were people who were either captured or sold into captivity.
Most of the agricultural work in Africa is done by women, particularly during 15th, 16th century when the Europeans first went to Africa. They were also very, very active in the market economy, since at least as traders and even as long-distance traders. But Europeans, when they went to Africa, they wanted to get 2/3 men, 1/3 women. But one of the things that they found often was that they couldn't get that ratio. Basically, they had to take women because the slave trade in Africa was literally controlled by Africans. And they determined who would be a slave and who would not.
They're mostly tribal rulers, local chieftains, who really are managing those coastal areas where the traders come. And they begin to understand very quickly that this works in terms of procuring certain kind of commodities and finished products that they don't have from European traders. And so an exchange pattern is set up. Sometimes it's war captives, tribes sending other people out that they really don't even think of as their kind of people. And we can analogize it to the Protestant British selling the Catholic Irish, whom they did not see as part of their group. Or they might be people who were kind of a liability for their tribal or ethnic community, people who were criminals, people who were insane, people that we would now call mental defectives. It seemed to be a good way of getting rid of them.
If men were needed in a society for basically for protection and warring-based purposes, they would send women. So as laborers, African-American, at least African women, were quite desirable unfortunately, as slaves.
planters who grow sugar as opposed to cotton, as opposed to tobacco, as opposed to rice, begin to feel that black people who come from particular parts of Africa make better workers. They adapt more quickly to the climate. The death rate is lower. The disease rate is lower. Or they have some sensitivity to the agricultural crop because it was similar to things that they were growing in Africa. So you'll have people from parts of what we now call Nigeria or Senegal or Ghana beginning to be settled, and I use the term advisedly because they don't have agency, beginning to be settled in certain parts of the United States more thickly than in others.
At the same time that slave traders are bringing record numbers of captive workers to the country, there is also an upsurge in immigration.
The largest migration, of course, is the African slaves, and it dwarfs all other forms of migration in the 18th century. But in the early 18th century, you see two large streams of migration, the two largest streams, I should say, that will be important, and there are regional differences here. The Germans, German speakers largely from the area of the Palatinate, the German Palatinate, come in the early 18th century, sort of 17 teens on.
They're mostly German Protestants who find themselves in principalities where Catholic rulers don't want them around, or who find that their economic opportunities are quite limited in these German principalities of the early 18th century.
They come primarily into the middle colonies, into Pennsylvania, Delaware, the northern, very northern parts of the Chesapeake, often straight into Philadelphia and then spreading out in the backcountry. And their influences, if you visit western Pennsylvania today, you see it. Their influence in terms of numbers and cultural distinctiveness and religious distinctiveness and language distinctiveness is most important in those middle colonies and increasingly in the backcountry of those colonies. The other major stream are the Scots-Irish, and they come in just a little bit further south than the German migration. The upper Chesapeake, basically Carolina, and again, out into the backcountry. The Scots-Irish are the Protestants in Northern Ireland. They come not happy with the British, I suppose would be one short answer to put this. These people are not impoverished by any means, but they tend to be, in fact, fairly reasonably well off, what we would think of as middle class, comfortable. But their economic opportunities are very much restricted by the fact that they are Presbyterian and not Anglican. They're not Church of england. And so they can't go to they can't swear the appropriate oath that will allow them to go to English universities. They suffer from a range of civil and political disabilities. They also, many of them are active in the and vulnerable to changes in the linen industry. And Ireland, of course, is subject to, and very much, I think most people would agree, damaged by English mercantilist laws. They, too, are very important in opening up the backcountry, pushing back the boundaries of settlement, cultivating that land, sometimes on their own terms, sometimes as tenants. Like the Germans, this is another large, cohesive group, not English in their sympathies or their background, and in some ways antipathetic to the English. And these are major factors in the diversification of the population.
These newcomers are not always welcomed by earlier settlers, and yet people continue to come.
From the beginning, there was opposition to immigration. The Puritans objected to not the Irish, but the Scotch-Irish. That is, the people who the people from whom Daniel Boone came, the people who were supposedly the bedrock of America. The Puritans wondered why they continued to come into a place where they are not wanted. Benjamin Franklin continually complained about the Germans in the colony and later the state of Pennsylvania, who would not learn our language, who he said, if the Germans keep coming and we keep giving them the vote, then we'll have to have translators in the legislature of Pennsylvania. Every one of these groups has, in fact, become American, and every one of these groups has contributed to what becoming American means. And it's inconceivable to think of America without every one of those groups: the Irish, the Germans, African Americans, blacks. Asians were later proscribed. I met German intellectuals and students who said, you know why you're different than us? Because of African Americans, because they came in large numbers to your country and contributed things to the European culture. But we have been different from the beginning, and the Europeans understood that. We are the ones who didn't always understand it.
Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.